Hi there, this is Missy, and I am going to share some things about the law. I did go to law school. It was a Christian law school that taught basically that all of every single definition and every single rule and every single subject that operates in our courts today was founded on Christian principles. And so there's a lot of mantra in our societies and in schools that separations of powers and state, and actually that may apply to specific things, but that does not apply to the actual rule of law. That when you are charged with a crime, if you take something to court over a property issue, or if you're sued or you sue somebody, those are specific subjects that there's rules that apply and statutes that are passed in different states that they go by the specific rules of our laws. So that's what I'm going to share. And I think a lot of people believe that America is not that Christian principles doesn't have any place in our law. And that is just, I'm going to prove to you. I think we should prove all things, and I'm open to dialogue so long as it's respectful. And I am going to share every single definition and every single rule of law and give you the actual biblical principle from which it came from. The Blackstone commentaries, by the way, if you're not familiar with who William Blackstone was, William Blackstone was you'll see if you read a lot of cases, if you've ever gone online and you've ever done any kind of legal research, and you've probably heard the William Blackstone commentaries that are quoted to this day by judges. And who was William Blackstone? Why is he quoted in rulings, in many of the rulings across our nation? Well, William Blackstone was grounded in England's history. His commentaries on the laws of England are based explicitly Christian principles. He presented the law as a hierarchy with divine law, the will of God, found in the Holy Scriptures as the ultimate foundation for all human laws. So I think a lot of the people who propagate to our youth today, they act like Christian faith has no principle in the rulings, and it's just not true. And if you really don't believe that our law that still exists today is founded on Christian principles, some of that pragmatism has sort of dwindled away from the Christian faith to the point where Christians have to fight for their rights. That's how the Christian land and nation was founded. But before America became a government, this was basically an extension of Britain after they took over the Indians' lands, and those wars back in those days. In the 1600s, the crown courts were established in this land. This is before it became America. There were courts established in this land, and it was based on Magna Carta, and a lot of it was the papacy, and so the papacy became not the rule of law anymore, because many people escaped and fled from the torture and execution and the Bible wars and became many different denominations, and they fled to this land and colonized. There were capitalists who came here. They weren't really fleeing for religious reasons. They were just capitalists looking for new basically things to possess and own. But those were under the crown. And when the people, the colonies, came here and they said, no, we're not going to be under the crown. We're going to be a new nation. This land is not going to be Britain's. This land is not going to be under the papacy. This land is not going to be under the crown. We're going to form a new government. And that is when the American documents were founded. But the courts that were already established in the land had Christian principles in every subject, whether it be real estate, criminal procedure, criminal law, civil procedure, torts, contracts, Every single subject has a definition and a rule. And that's how judges come to their rulings when they decide something in any kind of case. And a lot of people, I think, they think just courts, well, they're just legislators and they pass laws and these statutes, and that's what the judges have to go by when they make rulings. Well, in a sense, yes, but those statutes are based upon these specific rules that have been in place for centuries. Contracts, for example, has very specific rules. And while there might be some little bit of, like, for example, negligence and the defenses to negligence in tort law, some statutes might vary a little bit on the defenses of negligence, but the basic principles of our laws and our nation are based upon the Bible. Like in the Middle East, you have Sharia law, you have the Quran, and you have their laws are established by the principles of their book. But in America, this is why when you look around and you will see in many places across the United States of America, cop cars have "In God We Trust" on them to this day. In courts, you will have "In God We Trust" to this day. To this day. In our money, it says "In God We Trust." So while some things they have given specific rights to people to not have to in any way be oppressed by anybody who wants to force any kind of faith on them, they have the right to not have to be subjected to that. But when it comes to the basic principles of inalienable rights, it all falls to the law. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share some examples about these subjects. We'll start with the subject of torts. Torts is when you sue somebody. If somebody commits a trespass to your land, which technically that's property law also, but there are torts, and while property law will combine with that, and property law could vary as far as statute from state to state, but they boil down to specific definitions. Trespass to land. Trespass to land is the intentional entry upon land and possession of another without consent or privilege. Trespass to chattel. Trespass to chattel is the intentional interference with chattel and possession of another without consent or privilege. Conversion. Conversion is the intentional exercise of wrongful dominion and control over the chattel of another without consent or privilege. So where did they come up with these rules? How did they make these definitions to decide what specific act is what? Where does it come from? So that's what I'm going to share. And the William Blackstone commentaries are still widely used in many courts in America. So on these specific definitions that I just shared with you, every single definition has a Bible verse. Literally has a Bible verse that the principle of that specific definition came from. Literally. So under these specific definitions that I just shared with you, I'm going to share with you the verses of which basically they come from. So Exodus 22 verses 5 through 6. If a man shall cause a field or vineyard to be eaten, and shall put in his beast, and shall feed in another man's field, of the best of his own field, and of the best of his own vineyard shall he make restitution. If a fire break out and catch in thorns, so that its stacks of corn or the standing corn of the field be consumed therewith, he that kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. So it deals with someone who intentionally causes. So that's what trespass to land, intentional entry. Notice the word in the definition, intentional entry. Okay? If you cause your animals to forage on another man's property, he is required to repay with the best of his field and with the best fruit of his vineyard. But if you accidentally burn a field that contains crops, is only required to make restitution without the specification that it be his best. This was the Bible. That's how God ordained that, being fair to one another, if you do specific acts or you by neglect cause specific acts, or so it's illustrating a principle that intentional torts against property should receive a greater penalty than unintentional torts. Motives that could cause a person to intentionally destroy his neighborhood's property. Consider 2 Samuel 14, verses 29 to 32. What was the end result of God's law? See Exodus 22, verses 5 through 6, not being followed. In 2 Samuel 14, verses 29 to 32. See 2 Samuel 18, verses 9 through 14. And then, so in the Blackstone commentaries, it says, we are to consider the injuries that may be offered to the rights of personal property, and of these, the first rights of personal property in possession, and then those that are in action only. That's talking about the conversion tort. And the definition of conversion, again, is intentional exercise of wrongful dominion and control over the chattel of another without consent or privilege. So when they make statutes that's going to govern how judges can rule on if somebody does this to a person, then, this is the type of remedy that they should be allowed. And it all goes back to the biblical. Like, there was Magna Carta, even though pragmatism has kind of dwindled. These original Christian principles still exist, even though a lot of it's been eroded. They still exist in our courts today. So when people say, our law is not Christian, we're not a Christian nation. Like, if we didn't have Christian principles, that people can just steal from each other, they can just kill each other. If we don't have a law, we become our own law. Basically, all of these laws that says what is right and what is wrong, they're from the Bible. The rights of personal property in possession are liable to two species of injuries: the emotion of or deprivation of that possession, and the abuse or damage of the chattels, while the possession continues in the legal owner. The former, or deprivation of possession, is also divisible into two branches: the unjust and unlawful taking them away, and the unjust detaining them, though the original taking might be lawful. And first of all, an unlawful taking, the right of property and all external things being solely acquired by occupancy, as has been formally stated, and preserved and transferred by grants, deeds, and wills, which are a continuation of that occupancy. It follows as a necessary consequence then, when I once have gained a rightful possession of any goods or chattels, either by just occupancy or by legal transfer, whoever, either by fraud or force, dispossesses me of them is guilty of a transgression against the law of society, which is a kind of secondary law of nature. For there must be an end of all social commerce between man and man, unless private possessions be secured from unjust invasions, and if an acquisition of goods by either force or fraud were allowed to be sufficient title, all property would soon be confined to the most strong, or the most cunning, and the weak and simple-minded part of mankind, which is by far the most numerous division, could never be secure of their possessions. The wrongful taking of goods being thus most clearly an injury, the next consideration is what remedy the law of England has given for it, and this is, in the first place, the restitution of the goods themselves, so wrongfully taken, with damages for the loss sustained by such unjust invasion, which is effected by action of replevin, an institution which the mirror ascribes to sustain by such unjust invasion, which is effected by action of a replevin, an institution which the mirror ascribes to Glanville Chief Justice, to King Henry II. Now keep in mind, this guy, this William Blackstone, he's literally quoting the England law. Yet these commentaries, Blackstone is often quoted in our legal system. You can just do a Google Scholar search, or you can go on to Pacer and you can just do legal. There's a lot of different types of legal data research and that you can do, and just search for Blackstone notes. They're in a lot of cases, and a lot of our law books today still contain the Blackstone commentaries that basically judges will, when they're trying to say, for example, just as an example, let's say there's splits in our federal circuit courts, and maybe one particular circuit court will rule on a specific thing in one way, and then there's another circuit court that's ruling on the same issue in a different way, causing division in our nation. So the United States Supreme Court takes up the case to, basically put this is going to be how it's going to be ruled on this issue across the nation. And you'll see that they may take notes from Blackstone commentaries. Some federal judges in district levels or circuit levels could do this. State courts can do this. You'll just see that they use these analyses to this day. Whether they know themselves, based on what law school that they've been to, that these come from Christian principles of the Bible. So, under the law of England, which was basically a religious country at that time, it was based on Christian law, the Bible. So this is the law that still exists today. You can't take Christianity out of our courts and our laws, because while there are different social issues that are being ruled on in our United States Supreme Court, that does basically fall under pragmatism, if you will, under what the intention of our forefathers and the Christian principles. You still have all of these rules in these different subjects. So if you go to law school, you have to study every single subject. Okay, some of them. Okay, it's like, for example, your basic subjects, torts. You have like subjects that when you go to the bar, there's specific subjects that you have to test on and pass in order to get your license. And so I'm just using it as an example: torts, criminal law, real estate, criminal procedure, contracts, just to name a few. So each one of those subjects has definitions of what each rule of that law of that subject is. And every single one of them falls back to a Christian principle. Every single one. They don't teach that in law schools today. And that's a tragedy. This history, how our country is based on Christian principles, must and should be taught in every school in the United States of America. Because you know why? Because it's part of history. This is literally history. How our law is written and is still operating in our courts today is history. It's a part of how our system in our courts work. It's like teaching what kind of government system we have. We have 3 branches. We don't just have a president, which most people focus on what the president is doing, completely ignoring what Congress is doing, because Congress has almost equal power as the president. We have balance and checks. We don't just have a president who has all the power of the country. And a lot of people look at this delusional idea that that's how it works. And it's not how it works, because the United States Supreme Court, which is basically put into place by both Democrats and Republicans and a president, those justices have a lot of power, sometimes even more than a president does. Each branch has their individual powers. Okay? And so when you teach in schools how our government operates, this fact that what I'm sharing here of how these Christian principles, like, no law school should be issuing licenses unless they understand the history of how our law and the rules and the definitions even came about. Because it's just an injustice, and it's deceptive, it's misleading. And so that's why I am sharing this, and I'm going to share just examples. I'm going to share specific definitions that operate in our courts today. For example, defamation, damages in the distinction between libel and slander. So you have definitions of what exactly slander is. And there's biblical, I'm telling you, there is a Bible verse for every rule and definition in our courts today. Nobody knows about this. Like, most of society is completely oblivious about this fact. And that's sad. That's a tragedy. And so I think that the youth needs to hear this. And so when they hear people coming out here saying, like, For example, the Republicans are just so beat down by people who are just like, don't pin Christian principles on me. They need to get strong. They need to say, excuse me, every law and every definition and every rule in our courts today are in fact based on biblical verses. So when you go to court, if you sue somebody, you're going to be suing. If you decide, let's just say, okay, if you want to sue somebody, you're going to sue them based on Christian principles, whether you want to or not, because that's the law in course today. Like, they need to be equipped with the facts. Knowledge is power. And just to shut these people up who keep saying that there's no Christian place. And I've even seen Christians like, separation of power and state. Okay, well, that had a specific purpose and a specific application, but we still have Christian in the Bible running the courts today, because that's what I'm going to share. So if you're interested in this series and you would like to learn how each and every, and you're going to learn the law while you're at it. Okay, I did go to law school, and I had to memorize this, every single rule and every single in fact, when I first started my YouTube channel 15 years ago, I was in law school, and I started it to, like, I have a lot of videos that are not set to public. You'll see that I have a lot of videos on my channel, but you're not going to see all of them because, some of them are just in the unlisted status because, so basically when you go to law school, you have to memorize every single rule. It's almost equivalent to memorizing the Bible. Like, I mean, it's just that much. It's like, it was a lot. It's a lot. It's not an easy course, but you have to memorize. So what I did is I recorded, and I had to memorize every single rule, every single definition, because in the test, you have to sit there and you have to basically analyze you're given a paragraph and a scenario and a situation, and you have to immediately recognize every rule that's going to apply in that situation, and then you have to literally write out every word verbatim of what that definition is for that rule. And so you have to memorize it. So that's what I did. I basically had to memorize all that, and so I'm going to share with people, because it saddens me that the basics of our law should be taught in school. I mean, you can't like go to the level of giving tests like they do in law school, but you could give a basic understanding of how our law works in our schools today. Nobody should graduate from high school without knowing the basics of torts and the basics of contracts. You don't have to test them to the extent of how, to the point law school does, because it's a hard test. You really have to know it to the point where you're going to be responsible for other lives, because, to the point where you're going to get a license. But just to have the basic understanding, so then when you go out, you're going to have, especially contracts. People go out and they can get just so duped because they're unequipped. They don't have a clue when they're totally being frauded, because they don't know how contract law works, or they don't know they're committing torts and they could be sued for something because they don't know. I mean, like, literally, they should teach at the very least, those two subjects, torts and contracts, at least. You know what I mean? It's just, people are so unequipped. This shouldn't be something that you go to a specialty school and then learn. It's like, okay, so for example, you'll learn the basic stuffs about the body in school, right? That doesn't mean like when you go to medical school, you have to learn so much more, right? But people are so unaware about our law, and these Christians are just people in general that are totally unequipped for actual appropriate conversation with people that present to them about, well, I don't want to hear about your position in politics because you just want to spread your Christian law. You just want to, propagandize me, or proselytize me into the Christian. They need to say, okay, well, I'm not personally trying to ask you to become a Christian, but I do want you to know, if you're going to talk about our law and our politics, then you need to know the fact that every single definition, every single rule in our courts subjects is based on the Bible. Okay, and they need to know that, and they need to be equipped on how to tell them that. And it's just sad. Our politicians, our own Republicans, are supposed to be conservative Christians that are, oh my gosh, doing so many things that are not even appropriate. And I'm not somebody who will go into a voting booth and click that box where I'm going to vote for a Republican. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to vote for a person, not based on what party they are, based on who they are, based on how what things they're doing. Okay, are they operating in a fair manner? Because there's a lot of Republicans that they need to be removing power. And there's Democrats who also vote what Republicans are proposing. There's no law that has ever been passed that's one party. It's by both parties. And so people also aren't paying attention to that either. And there's no leader that has ever been without fault. And I will never, ever accept any conversation that no leader has ever done anything wrong. I'm just like, if you feel like your particular leader of whatever your party is as just faultless, we probably couldn't even have a conversation, because we're supposed to, and especially if you're a person of faith, we're supposed to evaluate every single thing a person does, to include our own selves, okay? Our family, our kids. We're supposed to evaluate right and wrong in everything that they say, we say, or do. And that has, anyways, but I'm going to do this series, and this is like episode 1. And just the introduction to what I'm presenting, that here is my motto. American law is based on Christian principles. Fact. And I'm going to prove it to you. And with every rule of every subject and definition of every subject that is in our courts today is based on a Bible verse. And those rules and those definitions still law today. So don't let anybody tell you that our law is not based on Christian principles, because that's a lie. So stay tuned, because I'm going to prove to you that American law is based on Christian principles. And I hope you have a blessed day.